Today, we are excited to start off a new monthly series, which has been developed in collaboration with NephCure Foundation and the Gateway Initiative, with backing from the Kidney Health Initiative and the American Society of Nephrology. The inspiration for this series came from the multi-stakeholder workshop titled Clinical Trial Collaborative, which was organized by the NephCure Foundation, along with other stakeholders, including representatives from the FDA and IDDK, representatives from academia, and patient representatives. Today's session is titled Clinical Trials 101. Here we aim to briefly and very broadly highlight the 4 pillars on which successful introduction of new therapies rest. Number 1, patients' perspectives and patient needs, the regulatory framework in which we all have to act, the pharmaceutical and biotech industry as a driver, and the clinician as the boots on the ground conducting the trials. We are incredibly fortunate to have as our speakers today, Kevin Fowler, Vice Chair of the Voice of the Patient, Dr. Elisa Thompson, Deputy Director, Division of Cardiovascular and Renal Products, Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, U.S. Food Drug Administration, Dr. Barbara Gillespie, Vice President and Therapeutic Head of Nephrology, Covance, Adjunct Professor, University of North Carolina, and Board of Directors, Kidney Health Initiative, and Dr. Susan Massengill, Director of Pediatric Nephrology and Hypertension, Levine Children's Hospital at Atrium Health, Charlotte, North Carolina. Your moderators for today's session are Dr. Kirk Campbell, Associate Professor of Medicine, Director of Nephrology Fellowship Program, Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, Dr. Sunil Udani, Consulting Physician, Nephrology Associate, Northern Illinois, Lauren Lee, Chief Research Officer, NephCure Kidney International, and myself, Ali Poyanmer from the Permanente Medical Group, Kaiser Permanente Medical Center, San Francisco. We are also joined by Dr. Dia Vagyuspak from McGovern School of Medicine and Dr. Pravir Baxi from Rush Medical Center, both of whom are GlomCon Associate Directors and help navigate the session. Before we start off, a few words from Lauren Lee from NephCure Foundation, without whom none of this would have been possible. Thank you so much, Lauren.
Thank you so much, Ali. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. So I am representing NephCure Kidney International, but of course all the collaborators across the Gateway Initiative. Before we move, can you advance the slide? Before we move into speaker presentations, I'd like to provide a little context to help frame this discussion and share with you some background on the important Gateway Initiative. What appears in front of you is really the backdrop for today's discussion. In 2015, you're looking at the number of clinical trials that were initiated primarily by academic settings, and there's one lone industry sponsor initiated trial in phase 2. Fast forward to 2018, if you can advance the slide. This illustrates the surge in interventional trials, industry sponsored, but today, those blue dots probably, if we updated this slide, which we have to get to, there's probably an additional 3 or 4. In realizing and recognizing the challenges of rare disease trial recruitment, NephCure did a quick landscape analysis, and thus was born the Gateway Initiative. Gateway truly, if you can advance the slide, is a cross-stakeholder collaborative effort where we identified through this landscape analysis what are the largest barriers to clinical trial recruitment in nephrotic syndrome specifically. So looking at the FSGS and IgAN trials out there, how could we form work streams that could come up with meaningful and tactical solutions to help expedite recruitment and fill these trials? And this illustration, this graphic, represents those challenges and barriers, as you can see. So just a little bit about where we stand today with this effort, which was launched a year ago. If you can advance the slide, please. We have formed what we call the clinical trial collaborative, and many individuals on the call, speakers, are actively and really deeply engaged in this collective effort. We have 100+ individuals from across the world who are meeting on a monthly basis by phone. And this is an ongoing effort. Right now, we are, based on the follow-up from last week's meeting, our second in-person meeting, we're now in the execution phase. So people continue to be incredibly engaged and passionate about finding ways to overcome some of these barriers. And I think I just wanted to sort of set the stage for this entire series, but as well the call, and hear from, again, as Ali suggested, 4 angles and perspectives of drug discovery within the nephrology space right now. So with that, I think I'm active.
All right, thanks so much, Lauren, for a great introduction. You really set the stage for the work that needs to be done. So it's my pleasure to introduce the first speaker. This is Kevin Fowler, who is a very prominent kidney advocate in the patient advocacy space. Kevin himself has been a renal patient and has had extensive experience at a number of pharmaceutical organizations. So he's certainly been on both sides of the journey, and he's going to talk today about the need to engage patients in the clinical trials enterprise. So Kevin, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. Yeah, so that's, for anyone who's on Twitter, that's my Twitter handle. So just so you know, I'm pretty active on Twitter. But if you could just advance to the next slide. Yeah, so if you take a look at the slide right here, then I'm just going to start with this. Actually, I had to thank Barb Gillespie for this. This was in preparation for a presentation I gave at Kidney Week, and there was a survey I did with people with kidney disease. And when the question was posed to him is, if you did participate in a clinical trial, why did you participate? And, the thing I would draw your attention to is the area in green is looking at, I want to give something back to others. And, the one thing that's always kind of surprised me is that when we have these clinical trials, we never ask people why they participate in a trial. And if you actually look at that category there on the right in orange, there's actually probably some of those responses could also fall into that green category. So, this was not a surprise to me. Sometimes people talk about the need to compensate people for participate in trials, and just based on my professional experience, that has not been the case. So that was the first question: why did you participate? So they wanted to get something back. If you advance to the next slide, if you've not participated in a clinical trial, what was the reason? And if you look at the reason, is that my doctor and care team never discussed the clinical trial with me. And hopefully this is not a surprise to most people, but I think it just kind of underscores the primacy of the relationship between the physician and the patient, and how much trust that the patients place in their physician. So, I think as we go forward with the rest of the presentation, I'll come back to this comment here. Next slide, please. And so I think we will be now to talk about where I see some of the barriers are, and then I'll talk about the solutions. Is that and again, I'll thank Matt Breyer, who was at Lilly at that time, for getting me to think about along these lines. Is that if you look at the spectrum of kidney disease, there's an absence, I think, in terms of talking with people about their kidney disease risk. For myself, who had polycystic kidney disease, it's very much upfront because I saw my mother on it, and I saw my mother die on dialysis. But I think for many people, they're not aware of that. And I just don't know how much that's communicated, even post-transplant, some of the risk. I think the other part, though, too, is that I think this kind of goes back to the value of upstream interventions. I think that many people are applauding the innovations in dialysis, and while that is, needed, I think where I look at is someone living with kidney disease and may have children with it, is I define value as moving upstream to early interventions and to hold on to the kidney. And as we discussed last week at the meeting that NephCure conducted in DC, there's just a need for honest conversations that are not taking place between patients and their providers about the risk of the disease and potentially how a clinical trial could benefit them. If you advance to the next slide, please. So I look at the other part of this too, and this is, I'm actually in Boston right now. I was actually meeting with a nephrologist today, and I actually had a very positive experience professionally to inform them of the trial. And I think I go back to it is that, my experience professionally speaking is that, I hate to say this, but all doctors say, oh yeah, I'm going to commit to 5 or 6 patients, and then reality hits. And so you run into a situation where you begin to run out of patients, and you've got to find additional patients. And the other thing I'd say this too, and I'll just speak to this where I say the mixed response in clinical trials. I've actually heard some negative feedback from, and I'll go back to social media, about surrogate endpoints and the value of them. So I pose that maybe as a question to the community: is there a need for maybe education for nephrologists about clinical trials? That's just something that I've observed. And I had this conversation. I'll actually mention the doctor's name. I was here in Boston, met with a doctor, Dr. Beck, who could not have been any more gracious, talking to him about this clinical trial. And I think that there's a lot of physicians that want to advance patient care, but they're conflicted with their responsibilities. And then we move into solutions. That's where I think ASN may be able to help. But I think it really comes down to two, is that, Dr. Campbell, you may be the exception. You've got relationships in the community that serve as referral bases. But I think in some cases, maybe unlike Europe, where these relationships exist, I think sometimes there's relationships don't exist between the trial sites and the communities. So that just kind of closes it in terms of where I see the barriers are. Now moving into solutions. I would just say this, is that this is my suggestion. Barbie asked me one time to say, hey, what are some strategies to enroll people in clinical trials? And my response to her was, and I'll say it here too, is my suggestion to the community is to do a survey, and do a survey with people living with kidney disease on, first of all, kind of, testing my hypothesis to have an understanding, what do people really know about their kidney disease risk, and how much do they know about clinical trials, and where would they like to learn about clinical trials? And I would also add to that too, is understanding the patient narrative. I've got an article I just found out today. It's going to be in C. Jason, but I shared my patient narrative with polycystic kidney disease, and how that patient narrative gets formed from past generations. And sometimes that narrative is false because of the innovation that's gone forward. So I look at that as a solution to this challenge, is defining a new patient narrative when there's hope around the corner. And so I would just, my point is try to, rather than look at, a lot of these companies are making lots of money on these different tactics, is the community define what is the core problem with patients in clinical trials. And then once that issue has been identified, and that can be by subset of populations, it can also go into, African Americans, people, other people of color, is to then determine what is a guiding policy, and then have a coherent set of actions. But my suggestion is to, first of all, understand the problem. Next slide, please. And then I would also suggest doing this too, is, surveying the community nephrologist perception on clinical trials. Kidney News, the publication, does a great job of talking about all the different medications or potential medications that are in the pipeline. But I just sometimes wonder if there's a disconnect between what is in the pipeline and versus what the community nephrologist says. I just had a recent experience. This was again on Twitter, but it was really kind of a disappointing experience looking at the SONAR trial, which I thought was really made some headway. And, people that were involved with the trial, like Blotto, thought it was a positive step forward, but the reception by some of the community nephrologists was really quite surprising, to put it diplomatically. And I just think there has to be a new definition of what innovation is. Having a new, catheter or whatever for dialysis is great, but I think we have to start looking at helping patients understand how they define innovation. And I define innovation, anything that keeps me with my kidney, but ideally within, when I was diagnosed with polycystic kidney disease, I would have done anything to hold on to that kidney, but at that time there was no clinical trials. And just the last point is that I think that there's also, I think ASN leadership is doing a really good job of trying to change and support the use of clinical trials, but I think there may be a disconnect between them and the community nephrologist. So that's my solutions, is rather than come to you with tactics, is to really try to go back and understand what the core issues are. Next slide, please. And as we finish here, I'll just go back to what Secretary Azar has talked about, his vision for kidney care. And last year, when I was on the part of the Patient and Family Partnership Council, had an opportunity to meet with him and give him my vision of kidney disease care. And as he outlined, and kidney health as opposed to the system we have that rewards failure. What's very promising is that there now could be incentives for early detection. That's a great welcome change. He highlighted too the importance of slowing down the progression of kidney disease. That was one of his priorities, and also having increased investment in treating early stage of kidney disease. So that's everything this community is doing here. But the same knowledge that's being understood is now being transferred into other areas like diabetic kidney disease. So that's it.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Very helpful information. And you mentioned the critical issue of endpoints, and so it was a good segue into our next speaker's presentation, Dr. Lisa Thompson, Deputy Director of Cardiovascular and Renal Products at the FDA. And she'll be going over our endpoints as well as some of the challenges in getting novel drugs approved for rare disease, which is a challenge that we certainly need to surmount. So Dr. Thompson, welcome.
Great. Thanks so much, Kirk, for the introduction. And I just want to confirm that you can hear me.
Absolutely.
Great. So I'd just like to start by thanking GlomCon for inviting me to participate in this session today. I think if you've heard me speak before, I often say successful drug development takes a village. And so I think it's really exciting to have this opportunity to talk to you all about some of the challenges and opportunities in drug development. And I know, again, that you all have very busy schedules, so very much appreciate your taking the time to listen and participate. I think there are a lot of important initiatives going on at FDA to promote effective and efficient drug development, and also really to place the patient at the center of this process. But for this first session and this really first interaction with you all, I wanted to approach this at a higher level. I wanted to first briefly orient you to the endpoints and approval pathways in the US. I understand this is an international audience, but I guess we'll start with the US, and hopefully in the future you'll have opportunities to interact with other regulatory bodies. I also want to briefly touch base about rare diseases and some of the challenges in drug development in the rare disease space. And then finally close by making a few points about the endpoint issue, or what I refer to as the endpoint issue. Next slide. Great. So in the US, we really have two pathways to bring a drug to market. One is referred to as the traditional approval pathway, and the other is what's known as accelerated approval. Traditional approval is based on endpoints that reflect a clinically meaningful endpoint, also called a clinical outcome. In essence, an endpoint that reflects how a patient feels, functions, or survives. Or it can be based on what we refer to as a validated surrogate endpoint, which I'll define in the next few slides. The other pathway we have available to bring a drug to market is what's referred to as accelerated approval. And for accelerated approval, I want to highlight that this can be based on a surrogate endpoint that's reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. And then there's also this other type of clinical endpoint that we can use that I'm not going to discuss. But what I do want to highlight is that in the US, this is really our only pathway that gives us the opportunity to resolve issues related to effectiveness, i.e. verify the benefit in the post-marketing setting. Next slide. Great. I also want to highlight that there are some additional requirements for accelerated approval. To use this pathway, the product must be for a serious or life-threatening disease or condition and provide a meaningful advantage over available therapies. And again, this pathway also comes with the requirement typically to verify the benefit in the post-marketing setting. And there's also this idea or this ability to actually remove the drug from the market if the confirmatory trial fails to verify the benefit. I do want to comment here that at least for most of the kidney diseases my division regulates, we consider them serious diseases and life-threatening diseases, and therefore we believe they qualify for use of this pathway. Next slide. So back to terminology. I think people use the term surrogate to mean a lot of different things, but just to be clear, when we're talking about surrogate endpoints in FDA drug approval, what we mean when we use the term surrogate endpoint is an endpoint that's used in clinical trials as a substitute for a direct measure of how a patient feels, functions, or survives. And just again to emphasize, in other words, the surrogate endpoint is not itself a measure of clinical benefit, but rather we expect it to predict that clinical benefit, right? And so a biomarker, or rather surrogate endpoint, could be something you measure in the blood, in the urine. It could be an imaging biomarker. But the patient doesn't complain of that, right? The patient doesn't come to you complaining that their serum creatinine feels a little bit higher today. However, the idea is that the treatment effect on that thing in the blood, thing in the urine, imaging parameter is going to reliably predict and translate into the treatment benefit. And when we talk about surrogate endpoints from a regulatory perspective, we typically classify them or categorize them into 3 bins based on their level of clinical validation. One is the validated surrogate endpoint, which again can be used as a basis for full approval. Things like doubling of serum creatinine or a 30% or 40% decline in GFR, blood pressure, phosphate. All of these things have been used as a basis for full approval of therapies or are accepted as a basis for full approval. Then we have our other bin, which is the reasonably likely surrogate endpoint, which again can be used as a basis for accelerated approval, assuming the other conditions for accelerated approval are met. And then finally, we have this candidate surrogate endpoint. We think it could be a surrogate endpoint, but really don't have enough evidence surrounding it to support use in these other settings. Next slide. And with that, I'd like to switch to the topic of rare diseases. I think if you look at drug development over the last 10 years or so, we've really seen an impressive increase in the number of products being brought to market for rare diseases. And I think one of the main reasons, and many would agree with this, is because of laws that essentially created financial incentives to bring such products to the market. I do want to emphasize, however, that the laws that created these financial incentives did not change the statutory requirement for marketing approval. And by that, I mean for drugs being developed to treat rare diseases or common, we still require that there be substantial evidence of effectiveness and also adequate data to inform our understanding of safety and conclude that there is a benefit that outweighs the risks. That said, there is always going to be more uncertainty when we're dealing with drugs being developed to treat rare diseases. We're probably never going to have the same level of evidence that we can get when we're developing drugs to treat common diseases. And so that's something that's important to keep in mind. And also one of the reasons why the laws give us discretion when we're determining what is adequate to constitute substantial evidence of effectiveness and also substantial evidence, or rather evidence to provide reassurance of safety. And I do want to highlight as well, and I think you're probably all familiar with this, that there are also issues for drug development for rare diseases that are unique to that setting. And with that, I'd like to move to the next slide. So obviously the first issue that we encounter are that there are a few patients that you could actually enroll in a trial. So that obviously is one challenge. Another challenge we frequently face with rare diseases is that the natural history of the rare diseases is often poorly understood. And arguably, even though we think we understand a fair amount about some of the diseases and perhaps the role of proteinuria in these diseases, we're even discovering things like things that we called a disease aren't really a disease, but rather a collection of diseases. And perhaps we've known this all along. Take something like FSGS, which we refer to FSGS, but again, as you know, this is really just something that we see on biopsy, a histologic pattern, and really this is comprised of a number of different diseases. So again, it gets to this history of how well we understand the natural history of the disease, because we really do need to have a good understanding or sufficient understanding to design these trials. And then the last challenge we face, I think, particularly in rare diseases, is what I call the endpoint issue. Obviously, the selection of appropriate endpoints is critical for the success of any clinical trial. But unfortunately, for many rare diseases, really, we don't have well-characterized efficacy endpoints. That said, next slide. I think that there have been a number of really vital efforts underway to advance the endpoint discussion and work with the community to identify endpoints that would support approval of products to treat kidney diseases. The Kidney Health Initiative has been involved in many of these efforts, but so have other groups such as the National Kidney Foundation, the Polycystic Kidney Disease Foundation, and numerous other groups. So just want to highlight how critical their involvement has been to date in really helping us find a path forward. I wanted to use this time, just given that the NephCure Foundation is playing a critical role in organizing this session today, to highlight how we've thought about endpoints for rare diseases and primarily primary glomerular diseases characterized by heavy levels of proteinuria. And focus specifically on proteinuria, they want to emphasize that there are other endpoints that could also be used to establish the efficacy of these therapies. For example, for some of the more symptomatic forms of glomerular diseases, potentially one could use a patient-reported outcome to establish that the therapy provides an important benefit to the patient. But to focus on proteinuria, what we've generally articulated to sponsors is that if you have patients or study a population with a primary glomerular disease with markedly elevated levels of proteinuria, and your therapy essentially brings them to complete remission, however you want to define it, or a near normalization of proteinuria, that this could be a basis for full approval. However, where we've gotten stuck is whether and how some other substantial improvement in proteinuria could be used as a basis for approval, and have generally concluded that we think that showing a substantial treatment effect on proteinuria short of a complete remission could and should be able to serve as a basis for accelerated approval. But then, of course, this raises the challenging question of what is enough, how large an effect you need to show. And with that, I'll describe our approach on the next slide. So this is the approach that we've taken in an effort to try to use what data we have available now to guide us, with the understanding that as time evolves and as the data evolve and the evidence evolves, we will likely move to other approaches. But for now, this is how we're proceeding. We advise sponsors to essentially start with the design of the confirmatory trial that will be done in the post-marketing setting, and then work backwards based on the size of the effect on the clinical endpoint that they think it's feasible to detect in this confirmatory trial, and also a model of this, a quantitative model of the relationship between changes in proteinuria and the proposed endpoint in their confirmatory trial. We have them determine the effect size on proteinuria needed to have successful confirmatory trial. And what this means is that in their pre-market trial, to get accelerated approval, the magnitude of the effect on proteinuria in the pre-market trial or pre-market phase of their trial would need to be sufficient to provide confidence that the treatment effect could be confirmed in the confirmatory trial or confirmatory phase of the trial. So that's the sort of the approach that we've taken at this point, given where the evidence is at this point. And this has led to, as many of you may know, a number of development programs launching into trials that are intended to support accelerated approval, and then also in the second phase, often of those trials, verify the benefit. Look forward to engaging in further discussion with you, perhaps about this type of design and also other important issues in drug development. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that insight into the trial design. I think Sunil is now going to introduce our next speaker.
Yes, can everyone hear me? Yep. Thank you, Elisa, for the insight into the regulatory pathways that background that we oftentimes do not appreciate. As hopefully the audience can appreciate, we're kind of moving through the whole aspects of how a trial is developed and carried out, and of course the patient and the clinician side. Our next speaker is one of the bridges between all these different aspects. It's Dr. Barbara Gillespie, and she, as you can see here, has served as the Vice President in Therapeutic Head of Nephrology for the Covance Global CRO since 2017, and prior to that at Quintiles for over a decade, developing and executing the global renal trials. She also serves as a medical director and adjunct professor in North Carolina. And finally, she's the part of the board of directors for the Kidney Health Initiative, which is a extremely important public-private collaboration between the FDA and the ASN. And so we very much appreciate your insight, Dr. Gillespie, and your time.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so thanks to the organizers for inviting me to speak and for bringing us all together. Kevin and Elisa are tough acts to follow, but I'll certainly try. So Covance is a CRO. For those of you who don't know, it's a contract research organization, and sponsors will hire us to help conduct their trials. But I've been involved with early development, and of course, kind of interfacing between the sponsors and sites. So let me start with a few of the challenges I've seen from my vantage point. Starting with the protocol realities. And so these are metrics that have been taken from the TUF study of clinical research. And there are just too many protocols undergoing amendments. This leads to a cost in both time and money, seeing there in a phase 3 up to $535,000 spent and a delay of 3 months in getting the trial done. Similarly, with the entry criteria, again, there's just too many of them, up to 49 criteria per protocol. This was best observed by a nephrologist at a lupus nephritis investigator meeting, where he told the sponsor, if you could just, that you've got a perfectly written protocol, but no one will enroll because it's not practical with our everyday care, identifying the gaps we sometimes see between protocol and reality. So these are metrics across all therapeutic areas, but not new to nephrology trials. Next slide, please. Here are some metrics around study execution. For all the work that it takes for a site to contract and open one study, nearly a third never enroll even a single subject. That's a lot of work and a lot of effort to not gain anything. 90% of trials fail to enroll patients within the pre-specified recruitment period. They're seemingly always delayed recruitment time. Again, the cost is time and money. And patients are not always being retained in studies. And this leads to a pretty big impact on missing data, which makes the results difficult to interpret. Next slide, please. So protocol design impacts execution, and therefore simplifying data collection is really imperative in clinical trials. And I think in the past we haven't done this well, but as more stakeholders come together, certainly with the patient in mind, we're getting better at this. But as you can see on the left, this New England Journal paper cited that the complexity rises in a trial when you start to fish for that big net, and wouldn't it be nice to know analysis. The number of endpoints, procedures, and eligibility criteria have all risen, shown in this 10-year time frame. And what does this do in terms of monitoring scope and cost? Well, it all drives it up. On the right there in yellow, you can see that while 33% of procedures are related to non-core data in a phase 3 program, i.e. they don't support the primary or secondary endpoint, they do account for 35% of direct costs. So we need to come together and really simplify and figure out really what we need to ask in a meaningful way and how often it needs to be measured. Next slide, please. So we'll hear more from Dr. Massengill regarding the physician perspective, but I just want to focus on there in the middle, that CITI found in a survey that up to 54% of PIs actually choose not to conduct another trial. This is called the one and done PI. In their own words, you can read in yellow there at the bottom that it requires too much effort, not enough help, and no recognition from my section chief and others. On the right, conducting research costs me time, money, and effort that doesn't get paid. There's constant work, and it is all time-sucking. So this is not a surprise to hear from the boots on the ground. Next slide. When they delved in on the survey, the biggest reasons were here listed on the slide. Time, not a big surprise. The burden of reporting, safety and data information. And again, this is where we can really simplify and ask sponsors to really discuss with the FDA and pre-specify really exactly what needs to be done and how often. We don't need to fish for everything under the sun. And then the dissatisfaction with trial finances, contracting, and budget negotiations. So the good news is that of these one and done investigators, 44% of them do want to conduct more trials. So how do we better engage them and show them the return on investment? And some of this has already been touched upon by Kevin, so this is a great discussion we're going to have afterwards. One of the things that's been talked about is possibly CME credit for trial participation. This has been discussed among the general pediatricians. I don't know how far they've come with that, but it's on our list of things to consider. Next slide. And we need to embrace the fact that relationships have driven the science forward to date. So on the left, this group got together to consider trial designs in pediatric nephrology trials and create a roadmap, but they found that the group was split. The academic folks really focused on concept, whereas the folks in industry focused on process. Not a surprise given where they sit, but also there was clear value in both perspectives. So it's important to involve everyone at the table. And on the right, with regard to community physicians, so one of the surveys showed that I think 54% of PIs are actually community physicians, which was actually a surprise to me. And so I think networks like the GDCN at UNC, it's really important to engage them for referrals to trials, but also meet with them often. So an annual meeting, updating them on the trials and what their patients are doing is really important. So you don't just ask them to refer patients, but really keep them part of the discussion. Next slide. So from my industry perspective, I think the village has been thriving for a number of years. And it started with really putting the patient at front and center and seeing how trials are designed and conducted through their lens. So I have three quick slides to highlight this. But again, patient at the center with the advocacy groups helping, and then all the stakeholders involved. Next slide. So Eliza has already touched on renal endpoints, and I just wanted to highlight a few things from this slide. 7 of these 9 publications on renal endpoints have been published just since last year. So there's a real momentum here that really continues, but it also reflects the work of the last couple of years. 4 of these 9 publications are addressing surrogate endpoints: membranous, lupus nephritis, IgA nephropathy, and progression to CKD, with 2 more manuscripts for surrogate endpoints on FSGS and hyperoxaluria. And so part of the issue, as Elisa has described, is that the hard clinical outcomes in nephrology really take a long time to be met. So trial designs can benefit from surrogate endpoints to enable us to employ the accelerated pathway to get drugs approved quicker and into the hands of patients, but still requiring that post-confirmatory trial. And in that later trial, which tends to be longer, you'll see the benefits of the clinical hard outcomes. I want to note the 5 stars I put here, and this is where patients have been involved in these endpoint discussions. And again, this is really new than from when I first joined industry in 2006. Next slide, please. In keeping the patient front and center, I want to note that patient-focused drug development is a systemic approach to capture patients' experience and priorities in drug development. It's a mandate from the 21st Century Cures Act from 2016. On the right, here in glomerulonephritis, we've got a PFDD meeting on August 19th for IgA nephropathy. So I think it's really important to make patients aware and their caregivers of this to attend. At the bottom there's a photo of my cousin who's got nephrotic IgA. He can't participate in a clinical trial because he's not eligible because of nephrotic syndrome, but he will go and share his experience directly. From an industry perspective, I continue to encourage sponsors to attend these. They need to hear directly from patients what matter most and how trials should be designed and executed accordingly. Next slide. SONG, Standardized Outcomes in Nephrology, is another initiative to capture patient priorities. And these are global surveys to compare what's important to providers and patients and to determine what outcomes should be measured in future trials. On the left, I'll focus on SONG-GN. We last met just in April, face-to-face at the ISN, and some preliminary data coming out from those surveys show that the good news is that the top 4 outcomes, the top 4 priorities and outcomes are similar between providers and patients. They're in the middle: the need for dialysis or transplant, kidney function, proteinuria, mortality, and remission and relapse. However, patients rated cancer as the next most important outcome, whereas providers rated cancer as number 8. So we'll need to determine and think about if cancer should be an important outcome in future glomerulonephritis trials. Next slide. And finally, all of this ongoing effort gets us nowhere if we can't enroll patients and just get the trials done. We need to shift our culture in nephrology to mimic oncology in that trial participation is a meaningful option for their clinical care. So these 2 surveys highlight to those of us who care for patients that we're just not discussing the trials often enough. Kevin's data is on the right, NFPR on the left. 69 and 78% of us don't talk about trials with our patients. But yet, if we did, we could influence them. And so in GN and CKD clinics across the board, it should not be a question of if a patient will participate in a trial, but simply which trial. And so I think we need to do a better job of marketing trials in nephrology, like the ubiquitous pink ribbons for breast cancer and the stickers after donating blood. We need to mobilize some simple grassroots efforts to spread the word. So there on the bottom right, I've designed this button. If this was worn by all research staff and in every clinic, you're telling patients to ask you about a kidney clinical trial. That's a really great start for the discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much, Dr. Gillespie. And we will have time for questions at the end. Our next speaker, as you've alluded to, boots on the ground, and Dr. Susan Massengale is definitely one of the boots on the ground. She's a pediatric nephrologist that has spent over 20 years of practice in dedicating clinical research time to focus on nephrotic syndrome. Recently, she's been involved in the steering committee for the Kidney Research Network, which is basically a collaborative organization designed to conduct clinical trials, improve treatment options and outcomes for patients with glomerular disease, partnering across different stakeholders. So I'd love to hear her perspective on executing clinical trials and challenges that currently exist. So thank you, Dr. Massengale, for your time and insight.
Absolutely. I too would like to give a shout out to NephCure for bringing all the stakeholders involved in trying to push this envelope forward on proteinuric kidney disease. I think I'm kind of the nuts and bolts person to talk a little bit about this. And so next slide. I think when we were sitting down thinking about it, and I talked to a coordinator that I've had working off and on for the last 20 years, I think there's several things when you think about starting clinical trials, and I too would like to echo that idea of it should be much like oncology. When you walk in the door, what kind of trial can we do for our child or for our loved one? And so first and foremost, I think from a site readiness perspective, it starts with the physician, whether it's the academic physician or the community physician. You have to get his or her engagement and support in the trial from the get-go, or it's not going to be successful. And they too then are paramount, we'll talk about it in a minute, with their partners as well. But I think the other thing we forget oftentimes is that just because we're a physician taking care of people with chronic kidney disease, that doesn't mean we're really adept in clinical trials. And so I do think there needs to be some training and mentorship for those investigators that want to be involved, but they're not quite sure all the things that they need in their toolkit to be successful. I think after you've got an engaged physician group, then your next critical piece are your coordinators. And honestly, from top to bottom, they're what make a study successful, in my opinion. And I think having a dedicated coordinator that's available to run that particular study or studies certainly makes it easier for the provider. It makes it easier for the families. And we'll talk a little bit later about the importance of that relationship. And I think Kevin also touched on a lot of these concepts. I think from a coordinator training, they too need mentorship. And the question is whether or not that can be done at a local level, or as we were discussing last week when we were all together, is there a way to come up with a centralized hub or some type of process whereby there's some core coordinators that could help in certain aspects of the study implementation, helping out with regulatory documents, submitting to IRBs, or somewhat to be a resource for those coordinators at sites that are somewhat overwhelmed and understaffed. Something that we do at our facility here is we have a float pool of coordinators that get shared depending on when they're absent. Some of them are very trained, but we may take someone from our cancer institute to come over and help in our pediatric nephrology because we're down a coordinator or vice versa. And there's some coordinators that like moving around, but I do think you also need to have your core coordinators. And then from an infrastructure perspective, just knowing that you have to have what equipment do you really need to make sure that your study is, you can sample or process your samples. Do you have the appropriate storage and accountability for all the investigational products? Do you have phlebotomy resources? And those things just to be ready to do clinical trials. Next slide. As far as the principal investigator goes, again, I think it's key that they have a clear understanding of what their role is. And that can differ as to whether it's a pharma study, whether it's a prospective study, a retrospective study. Giving them clear clear ideas in this sheet. Dr. Gillespie mentioned before, what is their time commitment? What is it that they really need to do with respect to particularly pharma studies, going in and looking at all the queries that have to be done and some of the sign-offs that you have to do. So I think, again, having that idea of what your role is as that principal investigator, it's more than saying, yeah, I'm going to do it. There's a whole lot more responsibility to it than that. Then I think they have to ensure the engagement of their partners and their clinical staff. If you have engaged partners and engaged staff that help in recruiting to the study, then you're going to be much more likely to be successful and enroll more than that 1 or 2 patients. And I think, again, they showed earlier, you may think that you have 20, 30 patients to enroll, but you yourself may only be involved with a couple of those, and that's where the engagement of your other medical team makes it much more important. You do have to have dedicated time, and having a clear understanding of what that means, I think also can lead to the success of the investigator. I think it's also, the onus is on the investigator to be aware of what research opportunities are out there and for the patients that they're taking care of. You know, they're begging for answers, they're begging for results, and we need to, as investigators, need to be better at knowing that. And I know NEFCURE and the Gateway Initiative has a list of all the potential opportunities for patients to enroll. Unfortunately, pediatrics is not quite in that group yet, and we're pushing hard to try to improve the opportunities for our pediatric patients as well. Another key part, go back please. I think another key part is having a good partnership with your coordinator. We do a lot of pre-clinic visit, seeing who's coming, working well with that coordinator, I think is very critical. You need to understand your trial eligibility, and I could not agree more that if we could limit the amount of inclusion or exclusion criteria, that makes us study much more successful. And I think another key feature that we forget about sometimes, and in pediatrics, we often are more academically based just by virtue of our specialty. In the adult world, that's not necessarily the case. There's the academic and many more community nephrologists involved in taking care of these patients with chronic kidney disease. You have to be able, whoever that principal investigator is, you have to be able to establish a good relationship with that referring provider or that referring group with that clinical trialist, so that they know when they send you a patient to be enrolled in a study, that that patient's going to come back to them when all is said and done at the end of the trial, or be ready for the next trial, but that it's almost a triad. The relationship becomes the patient, the clinical nephrologist taking care of the day-to-day, as well as the clinical trialist. Next slide. These are some things that we thought were important for overcoming recruitment challenges. The first is having a good recruitment plan prior to you even initiating the study, and even before you agreeing to do the study. Pre-screening of patients for eligibility certainly makes things successful, particularly if your coordinator already knows that they can approach that patient when they're coming to clinic, either tomorrow or next week. And deciding where you're going to find that point of contact. Is it only going to be in the clinic? Is it going to be in the hospital-based patient, depending on what the study is? Is it going to be at the time that they get their biopsy, because you need tissue and blood samples? But kind of thinking it out before the day that that patient has their first contact. You need to identify and educate the key players. Again, that gets back to educate. What do you need of your partners? What do you need of your medical staff in clinic? What do you potentially need from the pathologist if you're using them as a segue into identifying the patients with FSGS or other proteinuria kidney diseases? And then advertisement, and every site's a little bit different on this. You know, some have to go through IRB, some don't. Are you going to use flyers? Are you going to do dear colleague letters? You can do lunch and learn sessions. We've done that with our staff here in clinic. And because our staff now understands the nuts and bolts more of why we do clinical trials, it makes them sometimes being our first point of contact with the patients about doing a clinical trial. And then I think you have to have ongoing evaluation of your recruitment plan. Are you being successful? And if you've only enrolled 1 or 2 patients, is it because they're just not there, or have you missed a real opportunity to get some other patients enrolled in these studies? Next slide. When it comes to approaching that potential patient, I think the trust that you and or your staff have with that patient is paramount. If they trust you, then they're going to trust you with respect to putting them in contact with a clinical, potential clinical trial. I think personally, my opinion is that I think when it's the physician that introduces the study, you're much more likely to be successful, again, because I think you've already got that established trust with the patient. Timing is everything. You may not want to do it the first day you meet the patient, but sometimes that's the appropriate time. And I think if we become a culture similar to oncology, that the exception should be not to approach someone about a clinical trial, then that might make it a little bit easier for the provider. I think you have to have a very well prepared coordinator at the time of study discussion and consent. You don't want them going in and not really understanding the study. They're going to be able to answer some of the nuances, and so they too need to be as prepared as the principal investigator. And then I think they also, as well as your physician, you need to continue to have an open dialogue to encourage communication about the study and what's the intent of it, what are the successes. And I think many patients understand there may not be a cure, but if it can help them or help someone else or even give them some hope of encouragement, and then I think that's a win. Next slide. Ensuring retention is critical. Not only do we need to recruit, but we need to be able to keep the patients in the studies. We've actually been involved in a study that's going into its 10th to 15th year on chronic kidney disease in children, and I really have come to appreciate the importance of retention. And I think, like someone mentioned earlier several times, the relationship is a key feature. And learn things about the patients. Our coordinators can go in and ask about prior, deliveries of the family, college, graduations, marriages, all kinds of things. That gives it a little personal touch, and the families find that incredibly touching. I think you can provide tools to the families or the patient to be successful in the study. Either give them calendars, clear and simple instructions. Instead of telling somebody they need to collect a 24-hour urine, help them do it. Help them be successful at that. Nothing's worse for something to go wrong in the study and the patient feel that they've let us or the coordinators down. So I think anything you can do to make it more successful, frequent reminders, newsletters, some families really appreciate. We often will reinforce the importance of their study participation to the success of the study. Without them, we can't win. With them, we can. And so we say that over and over again. And I think the other thing that some families really like is those little extras they get from the study. If they get an extra echocardiogram, or they get cardiac intimal thickness studies, or they get to know their labs, or those things that they might not get when they just go back to their community practice, you can share in those extras. And then when there's wins from the study, share those with the families as well. They want to know that their participation has made a difference. Next slide. A few keys to success, and just summing it up, I think you need passion on all people involved and belief in the clinical trial. And I think when you can show that, the patients and families are really apt to jump on board as well. You need that critical patient research coordinator relationship and that provider research coordinator relationship. These families are willing to offer an opportunity for alternate therapies, and so I think we need to offer it to them. I think we need to create a culture of research with all stakeholders, disseminate study achievements, helping people understand their value to the research that they're giving to a greater good, and always going back to them and thanking them for their participation and knowing that they've made a difference. And I think that's not loud. Opportunities to enhance on success. I think for all parties, education can't be overstated. And they can do that either through programs that we're doing like this today, potential partnerships, and there's a lot of conversation with the ASN, the ASPN, our European colleagues. How can we partner better to educate those involved with the clinical trials? And again, we talked a little bit about that possible centralized coordinator hub, trial awareness, increasing so people know what trial availability is. And I think the Gateway Initiative has been great with pushing that. And then, as spoken earlier, a little bit better understanding of the risk-benefit assessments and what we and our coordinators and patients are willing to assume. And I think that's this time, that is my last slide. And thank you.
Thank you so much for the excellent talk. And this will lead on to the next discussion. I think we'll have our moderators start asking directed questions to some of our speakers. And then after that, we can open it up to those viewing in on the group to direct some more questions.
Thanks so much, Dia, and thanks again to all the speakers. Excellent presentations. Kevin, just wanted to ask you from the patient perspective, what would you say is the biggest barrier to patients enrolling in glomerular disease or trials in the kidney space? What's the biggest barrier that you see?
Yeah, and I think I would first start with the first barrier is just to ensure that they're getting good care. So that's the first barrier, and many times that's not happening. And then I think the second part is, I think it's just, awareness. I would encourage everyone to take a look at the video that was done last week. You were there, Dr. Campbell in DC, and take a look at that video. What my experience has been, this is in Fabry disease and now in FSGS, patients want to learn about clinical trials. Many times they just don't know, they don't have the information, but they want to learn. And I also add the caveat too, I've dealt with some of the people who have come from the poor socioeconomic backgrounds, and I've had people who've taken a bus to go several hours to come to me to learn about a trial. So I think it's just elevating expectations, and the patient community needs to do that. So.
Kevin, Roger Rodby here. A great job. You just,
hey,
the
Roger.
first thing you said was make sure they get good care. I didn't quite understand that. I mean, anybody I've ever, any clinical trial I've seen, they're really getting excellent care. They're getting followed up more carefully than they would normally do. They're assured their medication. So what did you mean by that first statement, to make sure they get really good care?
So if they are in a clinical trial, that's another benefit of being in a clinical trial. But what I'm referring to is that people that have FSGS many times struggle to find the right physician that provides them with the best possible care. And if you want to learn more about that, I would just encourage talking to Lauren, Lee, or to Josh. But it's a challenge to find the right doctor.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. And Dr. Thompson, I think there's a lot of discussion regarding endpoints. I mean, is that something that's considered to be the biggest impediment to success for developing new kidney drugs, the lack of the surrogate endpoints? I mean, where are trials failing in our space?
Yeah, and I think historically that was a major impediment in a lot of spaces, but fortunately we've been able to engage in efforts with the community to really look at what the nature of the data are to support some of these surrogate endpoints or reasonably surrogate endpoints. And so I think we've moved forward on this issue. So I'm not convinced that that's really the greatest impediment anymore. I think what really needs to happen, or one of the things that needs to happen, is really to build this infrastructure to conduct these trials in many of the disease spaces. But obviously we need to continue to work on the endpoint issue. In some spaces, we still haven't gotten clarity on that.
And just considering, you sort of touched on the issue of heterogeneity, right? The different disorders. From what you know in our field, you mentioned FSGS, for example. How do you foresee us taking on the challenge of stratifying the disorders to target therapy more appropriately?
Yeah, I think that this is really a big issue. And, my opening comments about drug development really taking a village, it does take a village. I think that the community and the NIH and the scientists have done a tremendous job of taking us forward in terms of better phenotyping these diseases and really identifying what we thought was one disease and discovering that there are actually many diseases. I think we really need to continue those efforts. Hopefully, it's very important that these efforts get funding because it is so critical. But I'm very excited by projects such as the NIH project on the KPMP, the efforts to really try to understand what these diseases are and better phenotype them. But in the meantime, we need to move forward. We need to do the best we can with phenotyping these populations and getting populations into our trials that are likely to respond to a particular drug with a particular mechanism of action.
Absolutely.
I think the issue of placebo-controlled trials is a concern from a lot of people's perspective, both clinical as well as patient perspective. So I wanted to see if we could have some of the speakers comment on that. Kevin, from your patient perspective, if you were approached about a placebo-controlled trial, how may that influence your decision either way? If we could hear from a regulatory standpoint from Dr. Thompson, then Dr. Massengill, in terms of when you're framing clinical trials, when you have a placebo-controlled, what has been your experience in terms of feedback along those lines?
Would you like me to go first?
Yeah,
Dr.?
Kevin, if you could go first, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah, so I'll look at it from two perspectives. So if I were to participate in a trial and it was placebo-controlled, I would probably be reluctant to do that just because of the risk. Professionally speaking, I've been involved in trials that have not been placebo-controlled, and they're much easier to, quote unquote, communicate and offer the benefits of them. So that's my position.
Hey, it's Susan.
Go ahead, Susan.
We have, I mean, again, we don't have as many opportunities they do in the adult world, but again, I think it's a relationship you have with the patient and the family. And we've recently had 2 studies going, and 3 actually, and 3 patients randomized to the placebo as opposed to the study arm. And I try to, it's still an answer, and they're still providing an opportunity. And until we know side by side which one is better, I use the oncology model a lot. The reason they have advanced the cure rate in childhood leukemia is because they continue to tweak and tweak and tweak. And I say we need to do that as well. And so a lot of it is in the approach and trying to not let them think that a placebo is necessarily a negative impact, because in the long run, that may be where the answer is, and that the drug may not be as good as we thought it was. And so I think approach is important.
And this is Elise. I just want to add to this. I think this issue comes up a lot, not just in the renal space, but in a lot of sort of rare disease spaces. And I just want to highlight one thing to remember is oftentimes, even though we say it's a placebo-controlled trial, often you're adding a therapy on to sort of background therapies that reflect standard of care. Another issue to consider, because we obviously cannot ethically deny patients access to medications that are needed. We also want to point out that these trials can often be designed with early escape criteria, such that if it's clear that the patient's failing, that there's an out. And often they're also designed such that all patients after some time period actually receive open label medication. That said, I do understand why patients are wary of being randomized to a placebo arm. Obviously, many times we're entering a trial because we want to make sure we get an effective therapy. But do want to highlight that the reason we focus on placebo or active controlled trials is because frequently the natural history of diseases isn't sufficiently well enough understood to do studies that lack a control arm or that rely on natural history control data. And so while we are open to that approach, it really only works well to have a natural history controlled trial if you're in a setting where the disease course is highly predictive and the treatment effect is quite large, which occasionally happens, but would argue that many of our therapies really provide more incremental benefits. And at least for many of the renal diseases we're talking about, the natural history is not as well defined as we'd like it to be, in part because they're probably not just one disease we're looking at. We're still trying to identify all the diseases that we're actually looking at.
And this is Barbara, if I may comment. With regard to placebo, so Kevin, you talked about surveying patients. So there's a group up there in Boston, actually, it's called the Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation. And in 2015, they surveyed 12,000 patients, again, all comers, not specific to kidney disease, but maybe we can replicate this. And when asked about the top perceived risks and benefits before the trial started, the top risk was side effects, 43%. 26% said they were worried about risk to health, but only 11% cited receiving a placebo as an issue. So I think on a day-to-day, when we're seeing patients in clinic, it comes up. But I was pleasantly surprised to see this, and this is all mediated by awareness and education. We can talk to them about the side effects and the risks in placebo. But I think one thing in terms of designing trials, and often discussed with sponsors, is if you can provide a long-term extension and give them the opportunity to getting re-randomized to possibly getting drugs with that extension trial, that can also be a positive thing. And in addition to Elisa emphasizing that they are still getting standard of care, in a DKD trial I was involved with, the patients were saying, you know, even if I'm getting placebo, I'm getting better control of my blood glucose than I ever had been prior to trial participation. So again, you're still getting benefit from being in the trial, even if there's a chance that you're getting placebo drug.
Yeah, if I could add to Barbara, when I responded earlier, I said, when Sunil asked me the question, I said, no, but, step back and think about it for a second, right? That's a black and white response. I think would kind of go back to the whole thing about the risk benefit, right? So if I was in a situation where, let's say, my kidney function was declining, there was no treatment available, and there was an investigational trial to use this medication to somehow help the kidney, in that situation, I probably would do it. So, I think I would just frame everything in that risk benefit. Pam Duquette gave an example about her daughter when she was in a trial because they were really, their backs were against the walls. So I think it's probably situational to be more thoughtful. So.
Right, I think Dia, you had a question?
Thank you. Yeah, so I was asked to pass a question. Ali had to step out because he and his wife Miriam are welcoming their little girl Lily into the world right now, I believe. So we all wish him the best and congratulate him. And we'll look forward to updates. But his question was to you, Dr. Thompson, regarding the accelerated approval process. And, there may be some concerns within the community that they're approved based on surrogate markers and then may not always follow through with confirmatory trial to assess efficacy and clinical meaningful endpoints. So his question was kind of what could be done, and can you comment on what is being done to make regulatory requirements watertight and to make sure that these follow-up studies are actually done and conducted?
Well, I think that, first of all, I think that's very exciting. Congratulations to Ali. Wonderful news. I don't know if I can focus on my question because I'm so excited. But I will try. So I think that this is a critical issue for us about how to ensure that we ultimately get interpretable trials in the post-marketing setting and that we do the right things for patients, which I think is, if a drug is shown not to be effective, that the drug comes off the market. But we have a lot of challenges here, and it's really going to take not just the FDA, but really a partnership with the community to make sure these trials get done in a timely manner, that the physicians who enroll their patients in these trials understand that there's still equipoise and convince their patients that there's still equipoise and that they should remain in the randomized treatment arm, and that the community is frankly also supportive of the drugs coming off the market if efficacy is not established. I think, we actually for a long time did not use this pathway in my division because of some bad experiences with use of this pathway and failure to remove the drugs from the market, even when they didn't verify benefit. And this also gets to be a tricky issue because often what we find when trials fail to verify the benefit is it's not a slam dunk. It's not an easy conclusion that no, the drug does nothing. It's more that it's not really the level of evidence you want. And so there's a lot of grayness and a lot of questions about why the trial failed and is it really because the therapy wasn't effective. But we really need to partner with the community on this issue in order to make sure we do the right thing for patients and in essence, keep this pathway viable.
All right, thanks so much. I guess one question for Barbara. There are a lot of comments regarding the regulatory burden for sites and site PIs, especially busy clinicians, whether they be in the community or in academia. Do you foresee any initiatives to potentially reduce the regulatory paperwork burden that site PIs or sites may face?
Yeah, well, I know that a lot of sponsors and CROs, like to identify sites that they've worked with in the past. And so when you identify those sites and know their performance in the past and get to understand their process and continue to work with them, you don't have to go through everything from scratch. And so you can bypass some of the preliminary work and get some of that stuff going sooner rather than later. And that holds true for the contracting and negotiating and all of the other stuff that needs to be done. So I think we want to make use of the sites who we've worked with and try to simplify things for them, but also for the sites that come on board and sites that are newer to research, get to know them quickly. And so, their first experience will be their first experience and lots to learn, but by their second and third trial, we start to really make it easier for them.
All right, thank you. Sunil, do you have any thoughts?
I have another question for Dr. Massengill regarding relationships, and if she could expand a little on techniques she's used to develop relationships with referring providers in the community, because I think from personal experience in an academic center, there tends to be, you know, this somewhat of a disconnect between the community sometimes, and how do you kind of bridge that gap to help enroll patients that, you know, may not be under your care or in your group's care when you're in a place where you could, you know, could potentially have a wealth of patients involved?
We have done site visits before, just to, you know, face eye-to-eye contact with the people that you're asking to enroll into your trials is sometimes helpful. Yeah, it always helps out. I think have that relationship. You either meet them at meetings, you stay in that local area, you send out these dear colleague letters. It's trying to stay in touch. And we all want what's best for the patient. And I think trying to, I didn't realize it's probably a much bigger deal in the adult world than it is in the pediatric world. You're always going to lose a patient occasionally, because that's just the nature of the beast, whether it be a second opinion or whatever. But I think we've even talked about, do you need contracts where you're assuring that person that we're going to send them back to you when this study's over. We may ask them back for the next study, but this is a, you know, a pipeline that's going to be, you know, a circle. And so I think just with anything, it's the relationship part of it.
Thank you.
I think if you do it on a couple patients, then that trust is built as well.
Thanks so much. Are there other questions for the panelists?
If you have any, you can unmute yourself, and we'll give you a few seconds to do that and ask directly.
I have one other question for Kevin. You know, I think that there's been certainly other patient groups, cystic fibrosis example. I think PKD has been a good example of that have, you know, really mobilized to, you know, push the trial space as well as the therapeutic development space. Where do you see the challenges in glomerular disease, or what's been your perspective in terms of why it's been different from those other areas?
Well, you may be surprised by my response. So I'm actually, you know, connected to PKD, but if I look what NEFCare is doing, I think what they're doing is they decentralize the organization and putting some of the onus upon the patients to talk to other people about the trials. So I think that approach is a good one. I think the biggest challenges is I think that, and this can apply to any therapeutic area, but there's a lot of change happening right now, and patients don't know about that. And so, you know, it's just, you know, if you step back and think about it, right, what's the common denominator with someone who has kidney disease, especially the declines? There's a lot of fear. You know, I went through it myself, where you're not maybe operating the best possible frame of mind because of different things. And so I think there's a real opportunity for the greater community, the ASN and so forth, is to start telling that story. Because, you know, when people begin to hear the message of hope, that's the first step towards activation, in my opinion.
All right, thanks so much, Kevin. I think if there are no more questions, we just want to once again thank our speakers. Want to thank GlomCon, NEFCure for this joint initiative. You know, this is something that we want to sort of promote clinical trials participation by the nephrology community. And definitely stay tuned for more sessions like this. The next one will be the first Tuesday in August, and then we'll continue with disease state talks and one dedicated to pediatric trials as well in the fall. So very excited about this initiative, and thanks again to everyone for participating.